Welcome to, I think this is our fourth session together, maybe fifth. We are in chapter 3 of Deuteronomy, and tonight we are going to be discussing a God we can trust. The text that we were supposed to be covering for this week was chapter 3, verses 12 through 29, but tonight we're going to focus on just the last 8 verses, so chapter 3, verses 21 through 29. It's not that the division of the land, however kind of boring and mundane it might seem, there's actually, there's good stuff in there. There's tidbits, there's literary insights, but we are a limited people with limited time, and I'm going to try and keep myself to a shorter session this week. So if you do have questions or comments or things that you in those sections that we skip, you guys can always write me a note and let me know, and then I'll do my best to get back to you about that. But tonight we're going to stay in those last 8 verses, which include Moses' complaint about not getting to enter the land. And it's especially important to spend a lot of time on it because this is the second time we hear Moses say this, and it's not going to be the last. And so if Moses is going to say something 3 times, not only is it important to him, but we should probably pay attention when the Bible repeats itself, especially in 3s. So for the last 2 weeks, I have been working on a puzzle of the Great Smoky Mountains from a view of the national park at fall. And with the fall shades and the shadows, and also the pieces are not normal puzzle pieces. Some of them are, but some of them are it's really oddly cut. It's one of the more difficult puzzles I've ever done. And about a week in, I'd done this little section, I had it done, but a middle piece was missing. And it was a really odd shaped piece. And so I had sorted through all the pieces that I had left. I'm like, I can't find it. And I just kept getting this feeling the whole time, it's not there. This piece is just missing because it's so odd. When I see it, I should know it. And sure enough, last weekend, I finished it and the whole puzzle is done except this piece. My brand new puzzle is missing a piece. And so, it's really cool, and it's still sitting on the dining room table, and I'm proud of what I finished, but it's unfinished. It's incomplete. And it's a bit of a letdown that I put in all this work and just, sits there mocking me, this incomplete picture, you couldn't find that one piece that fits. And when I was preparing for this week and reading this chapter and over, I felt like I had 3 weird-shaped pieces that I couldn't fit into the puzzle. I knew that they fit in this greater picture of Deuteronomy, but they didn't fit the way I was holding them. I couldn't find their spot. And if I couldn't figure out how they go in the puzzle, this picture was going to be incomplete at best and awkward and not match at worst. So those 3 puzzle pieces are Moses' 3 statements in 137, makes it in chapter 1, verse 37. He says it again in this week's passage, chapter 3, verse 26. He'll say it again in chapter 4, verse 21. And the people are all gathered before him. And remember, this is all still the same speech in Deuteronomy. So all of these 3 instances happen in the same sermon, so to speak. And he tells the people, the Lord was angry with me because of you. And that is the reason that he doesn't get to go into the promised land. Now, that statement is jarring for a couple reasons. First, it's sudden. It's out of tempo and tone with the rest of the book. Moses is going along, he's describing what's happened to the people, their history, and then suddenly he really inserts his personal opinion, it seems, into the story. And he does it to complain about the people that he's supposedly talking to and inspiring, it seems, or he does it to present himself as a victim of the very people he's supposed to be leading. Is Moses really carrying around this bitterness at the people, and he lets his guard slip 3 times to suddenly have this whiny, pouty outburst? The entire tone of the book is Moses is his commitment to the people. It's almost feeling desperate at times how much he loves them and wants them to follow Yahweh and wants to prepare them for this new land, for this new life in the promised land. And yet, his anger and whininess doesn't seem to fit with that purpose. It really feels out of place. The other problem, besides it just not matching the tone of the book, is that for readers who, if you're reading through the Bible and you've just come from Numbers, you've read Numbers 20, and Moses, that ain't what happened. That is not how it went down. It was not their fault. We're going to read the story in its entirety in a minute. If you want to turn there now. especially if you're not familiar with the story, but it clearly reveals that Moses' own actions are the reason he's not going to be entering the promised land. The readers aren't the only ones who have seen those events, though. We read about them, but this generation, the people who are gathered in front of him in the biblical timeline, these are recent events for them as well. The community gathered in front of Moses in chapter 20 is the same community gathered in front of him here in Deuteronomy. Now, the first time we saw this, in 137, we might be able to understand Moses' logic. He's retelling the story of the wilderness generation's failed entry into the promised land. And the consequence of that action is for them to be fated to die in the desert. Moses includes himself in this story, even though the events won't happen for another 38 years, because one can understand that if then, 38 years prior, that generation had actually done what they were supposed to and gone into the promised land, Moses would have gone in too. So Moses wouldn't have been in the desert again 38 years later to mess up and be prohibited entry. So when he says back there, in the midst of the story of the first generation that didn't go in, he was angry with me because of you, like, it's your fault that I couldn't go in because you didn't go in. If you'd gone in, I would be there and everything would be okay. But when he mentions it again here in chapter 3, he's caught up in the story chronologically to the present time. So when he says, because of you, he is not addressing a dead and past generation. He's addressing the people right in front of him. And he seems to be saying, it is your fault. To be fair, this generation is the one who precipitated the events that we will read about in Numbers 20. But again, God only holds Moses responsible in chapter 20. There is no shared blame for what happens there. And then the last time Moses is going to bring it up in chapter 4, when he's going to say, because of you, the Lord was angry with me, the comment seems almost wildly out of place. Like, you're reading along and then you're like, oh, we're mentioning that again? And then he kind of moves on. So in preparing for this week, there was obviously so much in this chapter. So much that I wanted to cover. There's allusions and echoes to other scripture and echoes within it. There's a whole lesson on prayer. There's a big chunk on passing leadership and encouraging the next generation. But I just was stuck on that line. The Lord was angry with me because of you. Moses' apparent blame game was a missing puzzle piece that, while I could give you a very good idea of what the whole picture of Deuteronomy is about, I can explain to you what Moses is doing and what the people are hearing. If I did it without figuring out this line, it would look incomplete and awkward to pretend like that piece is there when it's not. And if one thing I hope that you know about me is that I'm not going to brush something off because it's uncomfortable or I don't know the answer or we may not like the answer. If it's in scripture, it's in there. I'm going to deal with it. I am not like, well, we'll just pretend it's not or come up with some easy, trite answer for it. I think when we have a question, if we push in, as I said the very first week, I don't believe God will disappoint. And he didn't again this week. So we're going to figure out how those pieces fit in. And we're going to start where it all started, which is back in Numbers chapter 20. And I'm going to go ahead and read the whole thing so we all are starting with the same knowledge of this event. So Numbers chapter 20. If you have a title, it might say something like Water from the Rock, which doesn't seem like, a horrible thing. In the first month, the whole Israelite community arrived at the desert of Zin, and they stayed at Kadesh. There, Miriam died and was buried. Now there was no water for the community, and the people gathered in opposition to Moses and Aaron. They quarreled with Moses and said, if only we had died when our brothers fell dead before the Lord. Why did you bring the Lord's community into this wilderness, that we and our livestock should die here? Why did you bring us up out of Egypt to this terrible place? It has no grain or figs, grapevines or pomegranates, and there is no water to drink. Moses and Aaron went from the assembly to the entrance to the tent of meeting and fell face down, and the glory of the Lord appeared to them. The Lord said to Moses, take the staff, and you and your brother Aaron gather the assembly together. Speak to the rock before their eyes, and it will pour out its water. You will bring water out of the rock for the community so that they and their livestock can drink. So Moses took the staff from the Lord's presence, just as he commanded him. He and Aaron gathered the assembly together in front of the rock, and Moses said to them, listen, you rebels, must we bring water out of this rock? Then Moses raised his arm and struck the rock twice with his staff. water gushed out, and the community and their livestock drank. But the Lord said to Moses and Aaron, "Because you did not trust in me enough to honor me as holy in the sight of the Israelites, you will not bring this community into the land I give them." These were the waters of Meribah, where the Israelites quarreled with the Lord, and where he was proved holy among them. We could spend a lot of time decoding this event. There is a lot of stuff there, but in the interest of time, and because we're just trying to get to the salient points for the purpose of Deuteronomy, we're going to move quickly through this event to figure out what is going on here, so when we get to Deuteronomy, we can understand what is going on there. The first verse in chapter 20 might seem unimportant, more just like setting the stage of where they are in time, but it prepares us with a lot of important elements that are actually important to the story. First, many scholars agree that when it mentions the whole community gathered, it's this nod, it's this way of saying it's the new community. That the whole previous generation has died off, and this whole community is the new generation. And it makes sense because what I'd never noticed that one commentator pointed out is that the 2 chapters prior to Numbers 20 are all these like holiness rules. We just got to get through them, but they're all on corpses, you guys. They're all on what do you do with dead bodies. And you know why it's important to know what to do with a dead body is when, 45 people per day are dying. It was their death period, and they needed to know what are we supposed to do with all of these dead bodies. So now that generation has passed, the whole new community, it's kind of like this bright and promising new future is gathered. It's also important because it's not the community that Moses had dealt with prior. Where they have arrived, where it mentions that this new community is gathered, is at Kadesh. And if that name sounds familiar, it's because it is. They've been here before, and things didn't go very well. So I'm assuming that Moses probably had a bit of trepidation as they set up camp, remembering how things had gone 38 years prior when they arrived at this point. And the Israelites had a complete and utter meltdown and ended up wandering the desert for 38 years. The last thing anyone wants is more death in the desert. The final important tidbit that I think often gets overlooked because it's just one sentence is that Miriam has died. Miriam is Moses' sister. She is the one who watched over him as a baby in the river to make sure the princess drew him out. She's the one who, wink, wink, nod, nod. We all know what's going on here. Like, hey, you need someone to nurse that baby? I might know a woman. And the princess says yes. Miriam is the one who's taking care of him since he was a baby. She is the one who, when he comes back as an 80-year-old, joins him in leadership with their brother Aaron and helps him lead the Israelites. She teaches them music and leads the congregation in singing. And now she has died. And it isn't just that she is dead, it's she's dead in the desert too. I mentioned this last week. When you die in the desert, there's no grave. There's no family plot that he can go back to remember her. There's no place where her name can be remembered. Her bones are just left in the sand. And instead of mourning who has been this great leader and someone who's important to Moses, the community has a total meltdown, and they are complaining. And not just complaining, as their ancestors did, they are accusing Moses, blaming him for their death. They're not dying yet, but they're like, we're going to die, and it's your fault. Moses has led these people for 40 years. That means there are 40-year-olds that he has been in charge of this community for their entire life. And here they are saying, forget it, we're all going to die. Sorry, lost my place. Moses had to have feeling, not only was he in a place where something bad had gone down, but he had to have been having another sense of bad deja vu because the whole water issue has come up before. In Exodus 17, after they've crossed the Red Sea, but before they make the covenant ceremony at Mount Sinai, the people come to Moses, the previous generation had, and they're at a place where there's no water. Sorry, I wrote it out in prose this time, and now I'm losing my place. All right, so in Exodus 17, though, it looks like it's the exact same situation to Moses. And when you notice the similarity, that's why it seems odd. A lot of people say, well, what Moses did in Numbers 20 is he hit the rock. That's how he sinned. God told him to speak to the rock, and he hit the rock, and that's it. And yet, if you go back to Exodus 17, God commands Moses to hit the rock. So yes, there is a difference in what God has commanded, but you can also say, okay, well, there is a strong precedent for no water, rock, hit rock with staff. But the major difference between Exodus 17 and Exodus 20 isn't the difference in how we're going to get the water from the rock. It's in the narrative setting and the relationship between the characters in the plot. The following points I'm going to go through, I owe a great deal to a Hebrew scholar and rabbi named Ari Lamb, who does Why Read the Bible in Hebrew lessons and focuses on the Hebrew and what we can glean from it. He has a podcast. He's active on Twitter where he does great Bible study. I mean, it's like turn on social media and get Bible study. One of the first things that Ari Lamb points out is to compare the Exodus 17 and the Numbers 20 stories and remind us that in Exodus 17, Moses is still the new guy. He is not only a new leader, he's new to the Israelites. Because remember, the first 40 years of Moses' life, he spends in Pharaoh's palace. The next 40 years, he's nowhere to be found. So he comes back as an 80-year-old, and yes, he's an Israelite, but he doesn't even have a Hebrew name. Moses is an Egyptian name. He's not one of the people. In fact, Moses recognizes that he will essentially be an outsider to them. And so one of his primary objections when God calls him at the burning bush and gives him his mission is that the people won't recognize me as a leader. They're not going to take me seriously. So when he returns to Egypt, his first stop is not Pharaoh. His first stop is the elders of the Israelites. And there, in front of the elders, is where Moses first performs his signs that Yahweh has given him. And at the end of Exodus 4, after meeting with the elders, we are told that the people then aman Moses. That is the Hebrew verb that is used. It can mean to believe in, but I mean, obviously they believe Moses existed, but it has more the force of trusted. So they have seen that Moses can do these things, so they trusted that he was indeed Yahweh's emissary and that he could speak for them. And they were going to kind of support him and they were going to follow him because it doesn't do any good for Moses to go before Pharaoh and tell him to let his people go and do all these signs that they're like, yeah, we don't trust you, so we'd rather stay with Pharaoh. But he has proven his power from God so that they can trust him. And remember that verb, that word, aman, to trust someone, because it's going to keep coming up. You fast forward to Exodus 14, and the Israelites are trapped on the shores of the sea. Pharaoh's army is coming, there's a sea in front of them, and they complain. So God instructs Moses, take your staff, raise your arms, and Yahweh performs a miracle. The seas part and they cross through, and you guessed it, guess what the people's reaction is? They aman. They trust both Moses and they trust Yahweh in that verse. Because of this sign, the miracle that has happened, and Moses' part in precipitating the miracle, they put their trust in both of them. Move forward again, not too fast this time, and things are bad again. And the people do not aman Yahweh or Moses anymore. We are in Exodus 17 now, and they quarrel with God, and they're testing Moses. That's why the place is named Meribah, quarrel, and Massa, test. That's what they say. That's what the place comes to be named as. It gets two names, Meribah and Massa, because they quarreled with God and they tested Moses, we are told. So to prove, once again, Moses' leadership and that he is appointed by Yahweh himself, Yahweh tells Moses to stand in front of the people, stand in front of the congregation, and strike the rock. Moses does. They have water. They can once again trust both Yahweh to care for them and Moses as his appointed leader and authority. Fast forward again, 40 years. Moses has proven his leadership now. But when the people start accusing Moses of bringing them out of Egypt just to die, to Moses, he feels like it's 40 years ago. And can't we all relate? No matter how much we've matured or grown or proved ourselves to know what we're doing, to have done a good job in the role we've been given, one phrase, one place, one trigger, and we feel like we're several decades regressed and all our insecurities just come flooding back. And for Moses, he's in the place where they failed. It's a situation where they'd failed. And this test of his authority, his insecurity of the people not accepting his leadership just comes flooding back at him. But he's not listening to what the people actually say. As they get rolling, they say, you brought us out here to die. Why'd you bring us out here? But the first thing they say, the first complaint they bring is, if we had only perished in Yahweh's presence with our brothers. Well, this is a very specific sentiment. Like, it's not if we'd only died in the desert with everybody else. So they're not just referring to everybody dying off slowly. They're referring to a specific incident. And they actually use the same language that is used in Numbers 16 and 17. This is Korah's rebellion. I'll talk about the high points, but you don't really need to know all the specifics. In the account, in the story, Korah and his cronies incite a rebellion against Moses. They challenge his leadership, which doesn't surprise readers at that point. Like, this is not new. Moses' leadership has been tested and tried. But what really is surprising in this account of the test of Moses' leadership is Moses' reaction. In fact, it is so surprising that Jewish commentators from 2,000 years ago were even commenting how startling and shocking Moses' response is. And if you're like me, you've read through Exodus and you've read through these stories. It's never really struck you before. But if you think about Moses, every time the people mess up, what does he do? He prays for them. He goes to Yahweh. He pleads for them. He gets mercy. He intercedes. And he spares them multiple times from far worse devastation than they could have had. But when Korah rebels, Moses doesn't swallow these challenges to authority and await God's mighty demonstration. This time, Moses seems to throw down the gauntlet with them and almost demands an ultimatum of God. He tells the people, all right, fine, tomorrow we'll figure it out. And if I'm still alive, then you know I'm not a leader. But if you're all dead, I guess we'll know who's in charge. This is basically what he says to him. And it's like, whoa, Moses is like, I'm done. Let's go. You're going to test me one more time? Like, Moses' attitude has shifted. Not going to look at Beth anymore. The sign to prove his authority is no longer using his staff to part the water or produce water, but the proof that he is the leader is going to be all those who challenge him dying. He is basically asking for their death rather than standing as the one who pleads for mercy. Now, Korah and those who followed him big time violated Yahweh. Like, they deserve the punishment they get, not because Moses asked or demanded it, but because it was a proper punishment for their sin. The point, though, is that Moses has never asked for the death of the Israelites before. He has always been this intercessor, even the one to stop God from destroying all the Israelites. But this time it's like he's been challenged one too many times and he's done. And so an earthquake swallows up Korah and his followers, and then the people complain about that, and a plague breaks out. This time Moses does prostrate himself before Yahweh, but he's not even the one who gets up and stands between the plague and the people. It's Aaron. Aaron's the one who stands up. Moses, yeah, he's on his face, but it's like this time, he almost just can't get himself to get up off the ground. As a result of this plague that Aaron stops, almost 15,000 people died. And it started the challenge where Korah gathered, and then where they're when they are prostrating themselves and the plague has started to sweep through the camp. It all starts in front of the tabernacle, or in another way, in the presence of Yahweh. So when in Numbers 20, just a few chapters later, they say, we wish we had died in the presence of Yahweh with our brothers, what they mean was, rather an earthquake swallow us, quick, sudden, we're done, than die this agonizing death that I'm sure they are certain is going to be their fate, dying of dehydration. But also, they've learned something about the tabernacle. They've learned something about the presence of Yahweh, and that is that it is no longer comforting to them, but terrifying. Moses had stopped being their buffer. Because back in Exodus 20, when they were confronted with the terrifying presence of Yahweh, they said, we can't go up there, Moses, we'll die. And Moses says, okay, I understand. I'll go up. I will intercede. I will be your buffer between the holy God and the congregation so that you can be in covenant with him. But this time, Moses didn't do it. And there's nothing standing between them and the holiness of God breaking out and swallowing them all. And so while they do definitely see Moses as the authoritative leader, their feelings toward their covenant partner, Yahweh himself, is under strain. And under this strain, they would rather Yahweh kill them instantly too, rather than giving them a protracted punishment of death by dehydration. So when they get to Numbers 20, they aren't testing Moses' leadership like it was being tested in Exodus 17. And we even see it in the naming, because we find out that they name this place Meribah too, but just Meribah, not Meribah and Massah. They give it the name quarreling. They quarreled with God, we are told, but we are not told that they are testing Moses. Their quarrel in Numbers 20 is not with Moses, it is with Yahweh himself. However, Moses doesn't hear that. Moses doesn't think that. And he's tired. He's tired of the challenges. He's grieving his sister. Nobody else seems to care. And probably, if I'm Moses, the last straw is when the people finish their complaints with this line: "There's no figs, grapevines, or pomegranates." We studied Numbers 13 and 14. Do you guys remember the 3 things the spies brought back from the promised land? Do you want to guess? Figs, pomegranates, and a grapevine so big they had to carry it between 2 men. And I just think Moses is like, do you know where they have those things? Across the river, where we were all supposed to go 38 years ago. Instead, we've been in this desert. My sister is dead. She won't have a proper burial. And can you guys just stop it? I mean, I'm just thinking that maybe he had reached his max. He calls them rebels. You group of rebels. And it's a verb that he's turned into a noun. Like, it's just awesome the way he does it. Like, you people who are just defined by rebellion. That is who you are. And so, this is what Moses thinks. But that's not what the people needed, was for him to call them out. It wasn't a season for them to be yelled at about how terrible they were, because they're still scared. Not just of dying, but that this God who they're traveling with, their only hope, isn't actually trustworthy. Because one of the other differences between Exodus 17 and Exodus 20 is that God told Moses not to get in front of the people, as he does in Exodus 17. He tells Moses, get in front of the people in Exodus 17 with your staff. Here he tells Moses, take your staff and gather the people. See, staffs are multi-use instruments. They can show your authority and be used as punishment, but this time it's not about authority, but shepherding. It's about caring. He was supposed to be on the side with the people. He wasn't supposed to be in front of the people this time. He was supposed to be a member of the congregation while God demonstrated his compassionate care by providing the water. God didn't need to help Moses prove his leadership position, to prove his authority. What God needed Moses to do was to gather the people, look at the rock, and say, he's going to bring water out for you, and to see the water come out. They were bruised reeds about to crack. They didn't need to be yelled at. But Moses didn't have it in him anymore. And so as Ari Lamb says, in the Bible, true leadership means doing everything you can to provide for those under your responsibility. Sometimes this means standing up for the honor of your office. But other times it means setting aside your feelings and showing your charges that they're still loved. Moses was the greatest of all leaders. What could possibly have been his undoing? What could possibly have been the cause for him not finishing his life's work? Failing, even for just a moment, to comfort those who are afraid. The way God phrases his charge against Moses in Numbers 20:12, when he decrees his punishment to Moses, and then it's repeated later in Deuteronomy 32, we're gonna come across God's punishment against Moses again, the consequences for what he did. It's notoriously difficult to translate, but it does start with Moses and Aaron. He tells us that they did not aman him. That verb comes up again. They did not trust him. It's what the people didn't do with Moses and Yahweh. But surely Moses trusts Yahweh. However, the Hebrew construction suggests that Moses was to demonstrate that trust by demonstrating God's holiness. It is this really, it's a word that's conflated together, and in a lot of translations it'll say, you did not trust to sanctify me, to prove my holiness. You get about as many translations of this line as you have Bible versions. But the NIV that I have right in front of me says, because you did not trust in me enough to honor me as holy. The idea is somehow that Moses was supposed to trust in him by demonstrating Yahweh's holiness. His actions with the people were to demonstrate his holiness. Now, holiness is a very Christian word, and we usually think it means moral perfection. We use phrases like holier than thou, but that is certainly a factor of holiness, is obeying God's standards. It's not what that word really is. Holiness refers to the complete and total otherness of God, his power, his majesty, his eternality, his justice, his beauty, his not humanness. He is not one of us. The Bible Project, in one of their videos on the word holy, uses the metaphor comparing this holiness to being like the sun. Beautiful, absolutely necessary for life. We can enjoy it, but from a distance, because if you get too close, it is deadly. Just because of its nature, not because it is bad or evil. We need God's holiness, but we cannot treat it cavalierly. Moses had made this event about himself. He presumed that it was always him, Moses, and God on one side, and the people on the other. He forgot that he was still one of the people, that he is not like God at all. He had been leading the people for God for so long, he forgot he was one of them. He's not over here. He doesn't get to decide how to do it. And this privileged, unparalleled position Moses had for 40 years, to the point of being called God's friend, had led him to an over-familiarity with God where he did not demonstrate God's holiness to the people, as was his primary calling. So it reminds me of a popular TV show, spoiler alert, for anyone watching Ted Lasso currently, season 2. All right, spoiler alert coming up. But this scenario reminds me of the arc of Nathan's character. So Nathan is a man, for those of you who don't know, who's in utter obscurity. He's respected by no one. He has no self-esteem. But the main character, Ted, Coach Ted, sees him. And not only that, he encourages him, and he uses his unrecognized skills to become a leader. And then eventually Nathan is given a position of power and authority by becoming an assistant coach himself. And he comes to identify himself as Ted's equal, rather than having the proper understanding of the dynamics of the relationship. The first time I watched the season, Nate's final betrayal seemed shocking. But rewatching it, knowing what was coming, I could see it building. So this analogy isn't perfect because Moses isn't building in his kind of over-familiarity with God, but Moses' tension with the people in Korah's rebellion help us see not that his character is changing, but the way he identifies with the people versus the position of God is changing. He forgot that God still is and always will be holy. He will always be other. Doesn't matter how many times you meet with him, it doesn't make him one of us or us like him. And no matter how much Moses had done for the people, he was not the same as God. Moses was never the one who performed the miracles. It was and always would be Yahweh who did it. So that was a relatively fast, a very full excursus of Numbers chapter 20. But we are supposed to be studying Deuteronomy. So how do we fit this in? Because we still haven't solved why Moses is blaming the people. All of Deuteronomy is based upon Moses being a good leader, upon him being that one word, trustworthy, someone the people can trust, truthful. someone who puts the people before himself. But if he's blaming the people for an incident that has no indictment against them and is an indictment instead against his leadership because of his selfishness and not respecting God's holiness, then Moses isn't trustworthy. And he's perhaps flippant or even manipulative to throw out these lines. He certainly doesn't take Yahweh's holiness serious and didn't learn the lesson if he's still blaming the people. He's doing the exact opposite, which is back where we started. But by the time I had worked my way through Numbers 20 and I got back to Moses, I don't think that's what he's doing. I don't think he's blaming the people. And it started by me looking up a prepositional phrase, because of you. Moses says it 3 times. He actually uses 3 different prepositions to say because of you. And all 3 of those prepositions can also mean on account of you or for your sake. And actually appear multiple times in the Bible, in Isaiah and Ezekiel and 2 Kings, of God doing something for your sake, Israel, for your benefit, because I want something good for you. A lot of the English translations that say God was angry with me because of you make it seem causative, meaning the people's anger or the people's actions caused Yahweh's anger. But I think Moses is saying the prepositional phrase to be objective, meaning the people weren't the cause of the anger, they are the reason for it. Because he loved you, he got really super ticked at me. Because he was trying to care for you and I didn't do it right, he got mad at me. He's not shoving the blame. He is reminding them he loves you more than me. In other words, Yahweh got mad at Moses because Yahweh had so much compassion for his people. Because the one thing they feared the most, that God wasn't trustworthy, he absolutely was. And he wasn't even going to pick Moses, the mighty man who could part the seas and bring water from a rock. It doesn't matter. God will always choose his people. Yahweh and Moses had been mad at the people a lot together. Yet even in that anger, Yahweh always reminded the people what he had declared in Exodus 34, that he is Yahweh, Yahweh, the Lord, a compassionate and gracious God, slow to anger and abounding in covenant love and faithfulness. Moses had not accurately represented Yahweh's character to the people at that rock. He did not abound in covenant love as Yahweh was trying to do. And while Yahweh had an unequaled intimate relationship with Moses, we learned last week that privileged position does not permit us to act like petulant children. God would never violate his own character to side with Moses when Moses was in the wrong and the people needed to experience the compassion of Yahweh, his grace, his love, and his faithfulness. It is this same character I think Moses is appealing to when he says his prayer in Deuteronomy 3, because he opens it, Adonai, Yahweh, Sovereign Lord, Lord Yahweh. I'm not sure what your translation says, but it's very familiar to the way that God introduced himself. The Lord, Yahweh, Yahweh. I think he's reminding Yahweh of his character. He also uses the phrase good land to remind God of his promise to Moses, because that is the phrase that God used at the burning bush. He told Moses, you're going to go and you're going to get my people because I have the good land for them. And Moses is like, hey, Yahweh, remember your character? Remember what you picked me out to do? This is my mission. This is my calling. We haven't gotten there yet. And you are a God who's gracious and compassionate. But in an awesome Hebrew pun, Moses says, let me cross over. And then it says, in the Hebrew, God was cross with Moses. It might say angry, but it uses the same wordplay. Moses wants to cross, and it makes God cross. And he says, enough. And we've seen this before, too, in Deuteronomy, haven't we? It's the end of an era. Remember when they were done wandering the desert, God told people, enough, time to move on. It's been long enough, let's go. And I think he's telling Moses, it's enough. He's a little testy. That phase is over. Your leadership of the people to the promised land is over. I will show you the good land, but that's as far as you get. The people must have a leader, though, and one they can one they can trust. Joshua has proven his trust in Yahweh, during the first spy mission 38 years prior, and he's been Moses' constant companion over the years. Moses reminds him of all that he has seen Yahweh do before and since, to remind him that he can trust Yahweh for this next phase. Then Moses commissions Joshua in front of all the people, making sure everyone knows that he is Yahweh's chosen leader, probably hoping to spare Joshua some of those tests that he had to endure from the Israelites, and hopefully saving Joshua from making similar mistakes that he himself had made that prevented him from finally getting to the destination. Moses failed, and it was a big one. He did not hang on to bitterness, as I had thought, even though he did hope he could change Yahweh's mind. He did not try to defend his behavior either, but rather seems to become more compassionate, more passionate, more devoted to these frustrating people. Rather than rehearsing his track record of greatness and the miracles he performed and all the things he had done right and well, he reminds the people 3 times of his own failure, not to try to shame them or to pout, but to remind them that God has no favorites. He chooses leaders, but his compassion is for all and no one, not even a great leader, especially not a great leader, is exempt. Last year we went through Acts, and I think if I said it once, I said it 100 times. God doesn't need anyone. He invites us to participate, but trust me when I say, if you violate his holiness and his sacred charge to shepherd his sheep, he will take you out. Because he's not going to side with you no matter how big your congregation are, no matter how many books you've sold, arenas you've filled, souls you've saved. If you violate his holiness in front of his people, he sides with his people. Yahweh was mad with Moses because Moses had prevented the people from receiving the reassuring provision of Yahweh in that dry desert. If it can happen to Moses, we better believe that we are even more susceptible and not nearly as special. For the remainder of his life, Moses would never again prevent the people from seeing and experiencing the fullness of God's covenant love. He dedicates what will become an entire book of the Bible to making sure that they know and rely on what they had doubted at that rock, and he almost prevented them from experiencing. So he will use his last breaths to make sure the people remember and are reassured that yes, Yahweh is a God we can rely on. Yahweh is a God we can trust.